Okay, welcome everybody. We have Professor Ray Jackendoff with us today. Before I introduce him, I'll make two small announcements. First, we're not going to be taking any questions during the presentation, so please keep your questions to the Q&A session. Second, for your information, we are recording this talk. It will be available on YouTube soon. So, our speaker today, Ray Jackendoff, Seth Marine Professor of Philosophy Emeritus from Tufts University, is an internationally recognized linguist and cognitive scientist and needs no introductions, but I will highlight a couple of points from his half-century-long, highly productive career. Professor Jackendoff received his PhD in linguistics from MIT under the supervision of Noam Chomsky and Morris Halle. His research has been mainly about the system of meaning in natural language, how it is related to human conceptual system, and how it is expressed linguistically. He has authored tens of scientific articles and book chapters, and he has authored 15 books so far, mainly on human language faculty and also on musical cognition. Professor Jackendoff holds honorary degrees from various universities around the world. He was awarded with the Jean-Nicot Prize in Cognitive Philosophy in 2003, and in 2014 he was awarded with the David Rumelhart Prize, which is a premier award in the field of cognitive science. He's currently enjoying his retirement by writing more books and articles, and currently affiliated with MIT as a research associate. Welcome, Ray. The screen is yours now.
Okay, thank you. I guess I want to share the screen, right?
Please do so.
Here we go. All right.
Yeah.
You getting it? Good.
Yeah.
As Robbie has said, I've been at this for about over 50 years now. And a lot of the time I didn't know exactly what I was doing, but just said, this is interesting, let's look at it for a while. And about 20 years ago, I realized that what I was implicitly trying to do was to develop a unified theory of knowledge of language. So I want syntax and semantics and phonology to interact properly with each other. And I want them all to fit into a theory of language processing and language acquisition. That is, I want to break down the barrier between competence and performance. And more generally, I'd like to see language as a whole fitting into the rest of the mind, so it interacts properly with other mental capacities. This is really ambitious, but you know, if you're in retirement and you are not ambitious, then what's the point? So I think we're actually making some progress over the years. And I've worked out the overall position. The original work was based on the relation of syntax and semantics, which was something that I'd been working on for many, many years. And the first realization of this was my book, Foundations of Language. And then that turned out to have very drastic consequences for syntax. So Culicover and I wrote this book, Simpler Syntax, where we went through all kinds of things, showing that syntax didn't have to be as complex and deep as mainstream generative grammar thought. More recently, I've been working with Jenny Audring, who teaches in Leiden University. And we started out just saying, let's see how we can extend the parallel architecture to morphology, which is her specialty. But it turned out that the morphology had larger consequences for linguistic theory as a whole. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. The work is developed into a book called The Texture of the Lexicon that came out in February. And we call this framework relational morphology. Now, an important feature of this approach is that we take a very hard line on mentalism. So Chomsky has this phrase, knowledge of language, and we're taking it very seriously, very psycholinguistically. If you're talking about knowledge, you're talking about stuff stored in memory. So what we want to do is to reframe the basic issues of linguistic theory in terms of the impact on memory. So the question is now, what linguistic elements does a speaker store in memory? And crucially, in what form? What's the form of the structures that you're storing? Second, how are these elements combined online to create novel utterances? This is the standard issue in generative grammar from the beginning. How do you create novel utterances from a finite base? And then the third big question is, how are these elements acquired? And of course, we can ask, how are they acquired in what is required of the human organism, of the human brain, in order to allow the acquisition of language? Now, as I said, the central concern of generative grammar since the very beginning, since 1957, has been on the creation of novel utterances. And I want to take issue with this as the primary focus. I want to say it's a focus, but not what the whole field is about. Now, another important feature of the parallel architecture is that it questions the sharp distinction between the lexicon and the grammar. We are used to thinking of these as entirely separate aspects of language. So there's the lexicon, which is usually thought of as just not a very interesting collection of stuff. It's just a list of words that you know. And the main concern, rather, is with the rules of grammar that are building novel structures out of lexical items. But of course, you have to store rules in some form too. So we could ask, what's the form of rules in storage? That, I think, has been rather lost in the field recently. But along with construction grammar and some of the other constraint-based schools of thought, maybe HPSG, we're taking issue with this division between words and rules. We think words and rules are stored in a common format, and I'll show you that in a minute. Now, here's where morphology comes in. Syntax, of course, is full of regularity. It's easy to create new forms, but morphological phenomena sort of hit you in the face with their idiosyncrasy. Nothing really, nothing really works entirely perfectly. There are lots of morphologically complex words that you can't build directly from smaller pieces. You have to store them. And in fact, psycholinguistic experiments show that morphological complexity plays a role in processing. So it looks like morphologically complex items can't just be built up on the fly. They have to be stored with their internal structure. Now, that's just the beginning. Let me show you how we conceive of morphology. First, I need to review a bit about the parallel architecture framework. Review, I assume that you've all read Foundations of Language, right? Well, you should. So here's what the framework looks like. The idea is that there are 3 levels of representation, each of which is generative: phonology, syntax, and semantics, or conceptual structure. And a well-formed sentence has well-formed structures in each domain, plus well-formed links among the structures. That is, unlike standard generative grammar, where everything is derived from syntax, you read off phonology at spell out and you read off conceptual structure at logical form. Rather, the relation between these components is that there are correspondences between them, not derivations. So they're double-headed arrows rather than single-headed arrows. And this is a nice way to think about language, because it gives us an approach to talk about the relation of language to other domains of cognition. So a basic question might be, how do you talk about what you see? In order to talk about what you see, you have to map structures, say high-level visual representations, into probably meaning in language. And you can't derive visual structures from language, and you can't derive language from visual structures. All you can do is to say there's some sort of correspondence between visual representations and conceptual structures in language. Now, that means that the way language is related to vision is the same as the way the internal parts of language are related to each other. And I take that to be a good thing that comes for free with this conception of the grammar. Now, you might say, well, where's the lexicon in this? I only see structures. Well, let's see what a word looks like in this framework. Here's the word pig. It has 3 levels of representation: a semantics, a morphosyntax, and a phonology. And we want to say these are linked together. The standard way of doing that is to put the levels all in big square brackets. That's how you do it in HPSG. That's how you do it in LFG. That's how you do it in if you worry about what lexical entries look like in the minimalist program, that's sort of what they have to look like. But what we're going to do instead of the square brackets is to use subscripting, and we'll call these interface links between the three components. So we want to think of a word as a part of the interface. It says, if you hear the phonology pig, you're entitled to posit a noun in your syntactic structure and posit the meaning pig, capital Pig, in your semantic structure. And that's how comprehension works, mapping through the interface links from the phonology to the semantics. In production, you start with the concept of pig that you want to express, and the interface link says you're entitled to map that into a noun in the syntax that you're building and map it into the pronunciation pig in the phonology that you're building. Now so that we have the beginnings of a connection to language processing via lexical items and the role that lexical items play in processing. They're not passive, they're actually controlling the building of structure. Now, this is really kind of boring, this representation, but it gets more interesting when we look at a morphologically complex word, say piggish. So here we have pig on the left and piggish on the right, and this is pretty complicated. So let me color code it to show you what's going on. So subscript 2 is holding together linking together the three levels of the entire word. Oh, let me say what this means first. So it's saying in the semantics, it's saying it's something that it's a property of being like a pig with respect to sloppiness. In the morphosyntax, it's saying this is an adjective whose base is a noun and there's an affix following the noun. And in the phonology, it says it's pronounced piggish. Okay, so how is this, what do the subscripts do? So subscript 2 says, again, relates piggish in phonology and noun plus affix in syntax and like a pig and sloppy in semantics, the same way the pieces of pig were stuck together. Affix 3 says this affix has the meaning of like something or another, and it's an affix in morphosyntax and it's pronounced ish. And subscript 1, now let's go back, now says not just it connects the parts of the word pig, but it connects the parts of the base of piggish and also through interface links, but it also says the meaning pig in pig and the meaning pig in piggish are the same. And the noun in the two is the same, and the phonology pig is the same in the two words. So we're not deriving piggish from pig, we're just saying piggish is related to pig by these relational links. Now, what do these relational links mean? Well, you can think of them as marking the ends of association lines. So the black lines, the black arrows are giving us interface links, and the red double-headed arrows are giving us relational links. Now, you could do everything this way. You could do all your morphology this way, but as soon as you start adding pieces in, it gets really sloppy and very difficult to read, and it looks like a bunch of spaghetti. So we'll have to stick with the subscripting, which is a little harder, a little less intuitive, but you can build on it. Now, again, what this is showing is that instead of standard word formation rules that say to form an adjective from a noun, add ish to it. So that's a procedure that is building things step by step. This is just saying the noun pig and the adjective piggish are related in the way indicated by the relational links. One you to notice also that sloppy in the semantics isn't linked to anything. This is an idiosyncratic part of the word meaning. So it tells you that piggish means not just like a pig, but like a pig specifically in sloppiness, not say in pinkness. Now, okay, this is building up, but it's still the relation between the whole word piggish and its base is 1-to-1. For each part in the phonology, there's a part in the syntax and a part in the semantics, but that isn't always the case. So things aren't always this straightforward. So think about the plural sheep in English. It has to have, it has to mean that it's plural, and it has to have a plural feature in morphosyntax so that we can do number agreement, so we can get the difference between this pig is in singular and those pigs are in plural. But this, so we see that the plurality in the semantics and the plural marker in the morphosyntax are connected with subscript 6. But there's nothing connected to subscript 6 in the phonology. Okay, it's just left out. So what the phonology has is a co-index 4 to say this is the same pronunciation as the singular sheep, and subscript 7, which says this is the whole word connected to the plural of sheep in the semantics and a plural noun in the morphosyntax. So there's no zero morpheme as there is in many traditional treatments. It's not sheep plus 0, it's just plain old sheep, not with nothing that connects to the morphosyntax or plurality in semantics. Okay, so we'll see many more cases where we're lacking a one-to-one relation as we go along. But next thing we want to do is express the parallelism among all the ish words, so piggish and childish and foolish and thuggish and sluggish and so on. So in order to do this, we have to introduce a schema for ish. So the schema has variables on all 3 levels. It's saying if you want to talk about a property of being something, that's the variable a property of being like something, that's the variable x. The something is variable x. You can do this with an adjective that's made up of a noun that means x plus an affix, and it's pronounced however the noun is pronounced. That's the phonological variable, and it's pronounced how the noun is pronounced, followed by ish. So in this schema, the variables are linked by variable co-indices. So variable index y connects the 3 levels of the whole schema. That's in green. Right. This is really hard to say. I hope you're following me. And a variable co-index x connects the levels of the base. And the idea behind the variable indices is that the variables can be instantiated by anything with the same pattern of links. So here we see the schema and 2 of its instances, piggish again and childish. Co-index 3 is a constant. The affix is pronounced as ish and has the same meaning in all 3. That's in blue. The variable index x for the base is realized as 1 in piggish and 8 in childish. That's in red. And co-index y, the whole word is realized as 2 in piggish and 9 in childish, and that's in green. And notice that silly and sloppy aren't connected to anything. Those are idiosyncratic parts of the word meaning. So as we said before, piggish doesn't just mean like a pig, it means like a pig in sloppiness. Like a child, childish doesn't just mean like a child, it means like a child and sort of silly. Immature, not childlike, like a child in purity and simplicity and so on. Okay, so now we have these morphological schemas. What do we do with them? Where do they belong in the grammar? Well, our idea is that instead, if you look at a traditional intro linguistics textbook, they'll say chapter 1, phonology, chapter 2, morphology, chapter 3, syntax, chapter 4, semantics. Maybe somewhere in there is pragmatics and phonetics. We want to say it's that morphology, just like phrasal grammar, involves phonology, syntax, and semantics, all 3 of them, but below the word level. So relational morphology is concerned with the structure of morphosyntax, plus its interfaces to phrasal syntax and to the phonology and the semantics of words. So morphology is about all the components that are shown in red here. Now, this idea of the 2 layers of phrasal grammar and word grammar is not really new with us. Interesting that Emmen Bach thought of this, proposed this back in 1983 in the very first issue of Natural Language and Linguistic Theory. And it's also been proposed by Harry van der Hulst and also by Ackerman and Neleman in more recent work. But it's never caught on. It's interesting that it's never caught on, and it's not clear why, except maybe they didn't have parallel architecture in phrasal grammar either, or there were more influential people around. I don't know. In any way, in any event, the idea is that morphosyntax has a continuity with phrasal syntax, but still preserving the differences. So they morphosyntax and phrasal syntax both have nouns, verbs, adjectives, and prepositions. They both involve inflection, though in different ways. So in phrasal syntax, inflection is involved with agreement with other words. In morphosyntax, you have to worry about how to pronounce the inflections. Morphology doesn't have long distance dependencies. It doesn't have phrases, noun phrases, verb phrases, and so forth. So phrasal syntax has things that morphosyntax doesn't. But morphosyntax is full of affixes and has reduplication and templatic morphology and things like that that don't occur in syntax either. So there's a partial overlap between them. Morphosyntax doesn't reduce to some form of phrasal syntax as it does in, say, distributed morphology, but it's also not entirely distinct from syntax as it is in something like paradigm function morphology. And as we've seen with the ish schema, morphology isn't a matter of rules building words procedurally. Again, it's not like to form an adjective from a noun, add ish. Rather, it's a matter of saying, here's how these words are related. And there are a variety of theories on the market that state grammar in terms of constraints or templates or schemas, where you're not talking about input and output, you're just talking about relations among words. It's not just the parallel architecture, but also LFG, HPSG, construction grammar, and construction morphology, maybe cognitive grammar too. Now you might say, oh, what's so interesting about these schemas? They're just a notational variant of rules. Why are they different? Why should we prefer schemas over rules? After all, rules have served us so well for 50 years. So what I have to show you now is why schemas are better than rules. So here's some differences. First of all, as we've already seen, schemas are in this very same format as words. That is, they're pieces of linguistic structure that are linked by indices. And we can think of a piece of stored structure as more word-like if it's completely filled out, like a pig, like pig, and it's more like a rule if it's got variables in it, like the ish schema. That means we don't need to have separate constructs of lexicon and grammar. Now you might say, so what? But that's because we take the division between lexicon and grammar so seriously. It's been so much a part of fabric of linguistics going back for hundreds of years. I mean, you get a dictionary of some language and the grammar is a separate section in the back of the book, right? Or you write a grammar and it doesn't have a lexicon attached to it. We're saying that there's really one construct rather than two in knowledge of language, and that's really a major breakthrough, I think. You may think it's just philosophical, but notice that we can even take phrase structure rules and state them in this format. So here's the schema for a transitive verb phrase in English. It's saying a verb phrase can consist of a verb followed by a noun phrase. Instead of saying, here's a verb phrase, expand it as a verb and a noun phrase, or in the minimalist program, merge a verb with a noun phrase to form a VP, something like that. We're just saying, here's a piece of structure. It says, here's something you can use to build sentences with. This is what Janet Fodor calls a treelet, or actually the basic units in tree adjoining grammar. And it has structure in only one component. It's only a piece of syntax, without any phonology and without any meaning. This actually makes relational morphology a bit different from construction grammar and HPSG. Construction grammar insists that, or most varieties of construction grammar anyway, insist that the unit of linguistic structures the Saussurian sign, that is a piece of meaning connected to a piece of syntax and a piece of phonology. So it says constructions all have to have meanings attached to them. We're saying no, no, no. There are also constructions that don't involve meaning, and this would be one of them, the phrase structure rules. Another one would be things like inflectional classes in morphology, which have nothing to do with meaning at all. Okay, so now I want to look at another difference between schemas and rules, and this is one is more substantive. Schemas are more flexible. So think about this VP rule again, or VP schema. A verb is followed by its object. Now, the verb phrase schema is supposed to be, or the verb phrase rule in the rule-based systems are supposed to be the source of creative combinatoriality. So it takes items stored in the lexicon, a verb and a noun phrase and a determinant and a noun and a determiner from the lexicon, and it produces structures that are not in the lexicon. Now think about an idiom like spill the beans, which means reveal a secret. It looks like a plain ordinary verb phrase, and so to capture the fact that it has these standard structure, you want to say the rules generated from its parts. But you can't generate the spill the beans from its parts because it means the wrong thing. It doesn't mean pour out a bunch of beans on the table. It means reveal a secret. So you have to store this unit and say this is what it means, like a lexical item. But that means that you can't generate it because it's already in the lexicon. So how can you have it both ways? And I have to say, mainstream generative grammar is really very evasive about how idioms are handled. And everybody who's thought about it seriously acknowledges that you have to store them, but they don't always worry about how they have the structure that they have. When you turn to morphology, these kinds of things turn up all over the place. So think about a word like football, a compound. It does obey the compound schema. That is, you know that it's a ball that has something to do with feet, but it doesn't tell you all the things you know about the word football, like what a football looks like, what you use it for, what the game is, what the rules of the game are. All those sorts of things are associated with football. And you can't generate those from foot and ball alone. Another kind of case is words with irregular phonological alternations. So in English, there's about a dozen words that have the alternation in the past tense, like sing versus sang, or drink versus drank, where the vowel changes. But there's also another dozen or so that give you sting versus stung, or stick versus stuck, where there's a different alternation. There's no way to write a productive rule for sing that doesn't also accidentally catch sting. What you have to do is to list which words go with which vowel alternation. So again, you're listing the words, but if you're listing them, then how can you use a rule to generate them? This turns up with, here's another case. There's this adjective en in English that is attached to adjectives to form verbs. So wide, widen, to become wide, or to make something wider. Stiff, stiffen. Hard, harden. Black, blacken. Rough, roughen. And the meanings are all pretty predictable in this case. They mean to become that adjective or to cause to become that adjective. But if you write the rule for that produces those from the base, you accidentally bring in words that don't exist, like louden and safen and crispen. Again, how do you say which ones undergo the rule and which ones don't? Which adjectives undergo the rule and which ones don't? Well, basically, you have to list them. And once you've listed them, how can you generate them by rule? A fourth case, I hope you're not getting bored by all of these, but they're all really important to the story. The fourth case are words that have an identifiable affix, like commotion, the T-I-O-N, and impetuous, the O-U-S ending. Those are well-attested suffixes in English. but and they're typically, well, the TION typically attaches to verbs. So there ought to be a verb commode that commotion is derived from, but there isn't such a verb. And there ought to be a noun, impet, that is the base for impetuous, but there isn't such a word. So these are cases where you can't generate the word and capture the generalization. You have to list the words that exist. So these are all problems for rule-based theories. So the summary of the problems is that standard rules overgenerate. They give us Loudon. If we have the rule for widen, it also gives us Loudon, which is too bad. And they undergenerate. They don't give us the full meaning for football, and they don't give us impetuous at all because there's nothing to derive it from. A widely adopted solution to this is the lexicalist hypothesis, originating with Chomsky in 1970. And the basic idea is that regular predictable patterns belong to syntax, the productive rules. Idiosyncratic patterns belong to what might be called lexical redundancy rules. They're rules in the lexicon, whatever that means. So the idea is if an item shows any amount of idiosyncrasy, it's in the lexicon, it's not generated by the grammar. The effect is to remove from syntax all the traces of the impure. Some people think we should call that grammatical apartheid. Now, that may help you in morphology, but it still doesn't help you with spill the beans, because the verb phrase rule is regular and it belongs in the syntax, but spill the beans has to be in the lexicon. So do you want to say, well, there's a rule that forms regular verb phrases in the syntax, and then there's a lexical rule with exactly the same structure in the lexicon. Is that what you want to say? Well, do we want the very same rule, again, in the lexicon as we need in the grammar? Well, the solution that we're proposing is a second important difference between schemas and rules. So the idea is that unlike rules, schemas play two different roles in the grammar. The first one is what we'll call the generative role. It's used to build up novel composite expressions, and it does it by unifying the variables in the schemas with other material. And this is basically what traditional rules do. A schema can become procedural by using the procedure of unification, that is a general operation that actively assembles pieces into larger structures. It's sort of a counterpart of merge, but it's much more, much more highly structured. The second role that we want them to play, schemas to play, is what we'll call the relational role, where it's capturing generalizations among items that are stored in the lexicon. So the terminology that's been used for that is they motivate items in the lexicon, items in the words stored in the lexicon, inherit their properties from schemas, or their lexical redundancy rules that tell you about relations among words. So in this role, in the relational role, a schema doesn't have to exhaustively specify the contents of the items being related. So, for example, it doesn't have to tell you about the sloppy part in piggish, and it doesn't have to tell you all the details of footballs. It just tells you the part that can be predicted. And the idea then is schemas can function in both of these roles. So even take something like the English regular plural, which is an S stuck on the end of a noun. This turns up in things that are stored in memory, like raining cats and dogs, make amends, odds and ends, shake hands. You can't generate these things because you have to know them as idioms, but they have a regular plural inside of them. So we want to say the schema for the regular plural still applies to these. It's the same schema, it's the very same regularity, but it's realized in the relational role rather than the generative role. And another piece of evidence for this comes from psycholinguistics works like by Bayan and Schroeder and Allegre and Gordon. They find that lots of completely regular forms are stored in the mental lexicon rather than generated online, particularly things where let's say the plural is more frequent than the singular. So shoes, the plural is more frequent than shoe singular, and it looks like shoes gets stored. And once it's stored, of course, it can't be generated by the rules anymore, but we can use the plural schema in its relational role to account for items like this. And in fact, it goes deeper than that. The regular plural shoes, which is stored also appears in collocations like tie your shoes, wipe your shoes, and so on. Oh, shine your shoes. That's the other example. Sorry. Here's another example. So let's go back to football. Compounding in English is productive. If you look for new compounds in the newspaper, you find some every day, probably multiple uses on every page. So it's certainly productive, but there are thousands of lexicalized compounds like football that conform to the compound schema. So we want to say that the productive ones are produced by the generative role, and the lexicalized ones with specialized meanings are motivated by the compound schema. So this solves the problem of rules that undergenerate, as we saw in football. The fact that their relational role doesn't require you to predict everything about every instance. But there's still the problem of how do you avoid generating too many forms? And the answer to that, so that was like Harden but not Loudon, right? And the answer is that some schemas function only relationally. They can't be used generatively. So let's look at harden, darken, widen, stiffen, loosen, and so forth, but not saften and not louden. You can generate them. The schema for the en suffix is perfectly regular in its semantics, but you have to learn which possible instances are actually words. And you have to learn the idiosyncrasies of individual instances, so you get lengthen rather than long and strengthen rather than strong, and you get embolden with this prefix. It should be just bolden, but you have this prefix that actually means the same thing, and you find it in enslave and embitter and so on. So the idea is that this has a schema that's only used relationally. The patterns where a productive rule would overgenerate are captured by a non-productive schema. And in English, the bulk of morphological patterns involve non-productive schemas. I gather that Turkish has many more productive schemas, but maybe somebody will tell me about this in the question period. Now you might say, well, that's all well and good for morphology, but in syntax, everything's regular and productive. Well, not so. We can think of that VP schema again as being used generatively for a novel instance like eat the spider, but we're still trying to worry about chew the fat or spill the beans, which have to be listed. We can say those are accounted for, those are motivated by the verb phrase schema used relationally. So it's the very same schema for novel items and stored items. It's just used differently. Now you still might say, well, okay, that's all well and good, but but even though in morphology there are schemas that are only used relationally, that can't be the case in syntax. Syntax is all productive. Well, that's not true. If you poke around the corners of syntax, and that's something that I found myself doing year after year, you find various patterns that are not productive. So take this NPN schema that you find in day after day, week by week, face to face. There are about 5 or 6 prepositions that can go in this pattern, but it's not productive. You can't say gun beside gun, which you might imagine using if you saw a whole bunch of guns laid out on a table. Or speaking of Russian dolls, you should be able to say doll in doll, but you don't say that. That's ungrammatical in English. So here's a case where you have a syntactic pattern where you have to store the particular instances. Another example would be this little determiner pattern that you find in what a job, such a job, many a job, hardly a job, but not things like who a professor or where a city. You have to learn which particular crazy little collection of things can go in this construction, which ones can't. So what we're finding is, So what we're finding is that there's syntactic principles, syntactic schemas that can only be used relationally too. So here's a respect in which syntax and morphology are parallel, and we never really noticed it before. So you might ask, it's logically possible. We have schemas that can be used generatively and relationally, and we have schemas that can be used just relationally. It's logically possible that there could be schemas that are only used generatively. That's what traditional syntactic rules are taken to be. They're only used generatively. But the answer is there cannot be such schemas, because you can always memorize new words, you can memorize new phrases, idioms, larger pieces of structure, poems, your part in a play, maybe the whole Quran, I don't know. But they all may retain their grammatical structure when you memorize them, so they're not produced by rule anymore. They're just supported relationally. So what we end up with is two kinds of schemas: the productive or open schemas that both generate new expressions and motivate stored items, and non-productive or closed schemas that just motivate stored items that can only be used relationally. But now, let's take this perspective and shift things around. And what are we saying? We're saying all schemas can be used in a relational role. Every one of them, both productive and non-productive. And the productive schemas are just like the non-productive ones, except that they also allow free online composition. Or you can think of productive schemas as ordinary schemas that have, so to speak, gone viral. Maybe I shouldn't use that term this month. But they're ordinary schemas that can be used generatively. They're just a special subset of the larger class of linguistic patterns. So we conclude from this that the relationships among items in the lexicon should be an important focus of research, because the relationships in the lexicon include all the generative rules, all the things that can be used generatively. So we conclude from this, interimly, that the notion of infinite use of finite means, which is very central to linguistic theory, but it's only part of the picture. It's only characterizing the generative role. What have been called lexical rules are not these relatively uninteresting add-ons to the grammar, because they're giving us all the partial regularities of the language, and even the completely productive schemas can be used as lexical rules. So if anything is an add-on, it's the generative role of schemas. It's the productivity that's the add-on. Only some schemas are capable of that. And this is a major refocusing of linguistic theory. It's saying we're really interested in the non-productive stuff as well as the productive stuff. And so it enlarges our ambitions for linguistic theory, among other things. Okay, I want you to bear that in mind. That's the big message. And now we go into some details, because I want to show you some of the things that we can do with this relational morphology formalism, some things that are awkward for traditional rules. And I also want to show you how it opens up some new and interesting questions. So the first case I want to bring up is something that I mentioned earlier in the talk. These are words that have a well-established affix, but the affix is attached to something that isn't a word. So it's things like gorgeous, impetuous, arduous, meretricious, salacious, and so on. We're used to thinking of these as a minor glitch in the system. If you look in a morphology textbook, around chapter 2, they'll say, oh, here's something funny that occurs, and then you never hear about it again. But in fact, there are hundreds and hundreds of items like this in English. Now, there are 200 alone with the OUS affix of gorgeous and impetuous and so on. So what structure do we want to say that they have? Well, let's look at gorgeous. It means something like beautiful. The affix OUS in phonology, pronounced us, is marked in morphosyntax as an affix, so the us is connected with affix by coindex 8. But the gorge part isn't a word. It doesn't have a syntactic category, so we notate its syntactic category with a dash. There's nothing in there to link to the phonology of the base, to the gorge part, because it doesn't connect to anything in the semantics. The semantics can't be divided into the meaning of the base plus the meaning of the affix, so it doesn't have any internal links either. So we're left with only the subscripts for the whole word and the subscripts for the affix, and that's all there is to say. And I think this is just about the right thing. It's just what we want the theory to say about the structure of this word. But now we need a schema that says there are a lot of these OUS words without a lexical base. As I said, there are probably about 200 of them. And that's what this schema says. Its semantics is extremely vague. It just says an us word denotes some kind of property. Well, that's just what adjectives do. In the morphosyntax, the word is an adjective that ends in an affix pronoun, and it's pronounced us. But we know nothing about the base except its pronunciation. So to use, and that's all there is to say. So to use Steve Anderson's term, gorgeous is partly amorphous. The us is a morpheme, but gorge is not a morpheme. The other, but the semantics goes in the opposite direction. If this were a canonical relation, we would have, instead of assassin, we would have an assassinator, someone who murders politicians. Where the is the person who. It's kind of funny that linguist and linguistics is a similar example, right? A linguist is someone who studies linguistics. Another kind of example I want to look at is more sister relations without a mother. Think about a pair like, but the two words are related through sharing a base, but the base isn't a word. So here are a couple of cases: ambition, ambitious; contagious, contagion, contagious; and cognition and cognitive. And you can see here how we notate their relation. I've color-coded it again to make it easier to follow. Ambition means some kind of desire. And semantics, if we say someone is ambitious, it's someone who has such a desire, namely an ambition. They share in the phonology the base ambit or ambit. They have different, but that's not a word, so we have a dash in the morphosyntax corresponding to that. The shun affix in one case and the OUS, us or shus affix in the other one. So we end up here being able to say these words are related. Now a standard approach might say, with word formation, might say, well, we'll put an abstract word in the lexicon called ambit, and that word will be have some marking that says, I cannot be realized as a word. I can only be realized if I'm followed by shun or shus. Well, that's the same thing as actually listing ambition and ambitious in the lexicon. And we're doing it directly instead of having this phony phantom word in the lexicon. The story gets even more interesting when we look at what Geert Boy has called second order schemas and what we're calling sister schemas. So look at these pairs: pacifism, pacifist; Marxism, Marxist; altruism, altruist, and so on. The left-hand member is some sort of ideology. The right-hand member is somebody who believes in that or practices that ideology. We want to say for the left-hand ones, there's a schema that says words that end in ism can mean an ideology. We want something, another schema for the right-hand words that says there's, that says you can, that words for an adherent of an ideology can end in ist. But we want to say that those two schemas correspond to each other so that we get these pairs. So here's how we do it. We have the two schemas. On the left, we have the schema for the ideology, and it's very much like ambition. It has a meaning and an affix, but the phonology has no doesn't correspond to the phonology of the base doesn't correspond to any category in the morphosyntax. On the right-hand side, we see an inherent of the ideology and the same sort of thing. What makes these two related is the Greek letter subscripts, which I've colored in and circled. So the alpha says if there's an ideology on the left, there's an inherent of that very same ideology on the right. And if the phonology ends in ism, if the ideology ends in ism, then the adherent of the ideology ends in is. This is very hard to explain, but once you get it, it really works well, I promise you. So the point is that we now have a way of saying schemas are sharing some of their parts with one another. And this turns out to be useful for paradigmatic relations like inflectional morphology. It turns out to be useful for stem allomorphy, and for affix allomorphy, it turns out to be useful for truncation. All kinds of different things turn out to involve sister schemas. And the thing that's important to notice here, that this is a simple formal extension of the notation for sister words. It's very much like ambition and ambitious, except for the innovation of binding variables across two schemas. And this is now, if you're in a theory that says there's the lexicon and the grammar, if you even worry about the relation between ambition and ambitious, the relation between the ism and the ist words is in a completely different part of the grammar. It's in the it's grammar, not lexicon. So the fact that words and schemas work exactly the same is an important reason to believe that the lexicon includes all the schemas and there aren't such a thing as separate rules. Well, we'll carry on with that. We'll think bigger. You might say, well, that's all well for morphology, as I keep saying. That's all well for morphology, but syntax, no, there are rules. There are no sister schemas. That's crazy. Well, let's ask, and I thought it was crazy too. And but Jenny sort of convinced me. She beat me over the head for a long time and she won. So the question is, what would be the counterpart of sister schemas in syntax? And the answer would be, we have two different constructions. We have to adopt something like construction grammar. We have two constructions and we're saying there's a sister relationship between the constructions. And this is in fact sneaking into construction grammar, and they call it something like horizontal inheritance. Now, the reason I didn't like it was that it resembled a theory of syntax that was rejected a long, long time ago. I don't know if anybody here can guess what that theory was. So I'll tell you, it was Zelig-Harris's theory of transformations. You know who Zelig-Harris was? Zelig-Harris was Chomsky's teacher. And in 1957, Harris published a very long paper in Language on transformations. And he dealt with just about the very same phenomena that Chomsky dealt with in his 1957 book, Syntactic Structures. But he did it in terms of what in our terms we would call sister relationships. So here's some examples of how this might work. Here's an analysis from Bert Capella, although we've changed the formalism. This is the English particle alternation. This is the distinction between look up the answer and look the answer up. So we say, here's two constructions with the same semantics, X, and that semantics is shared, that's indicated by subscript delta, and that meaning, whatever it is, maps into a verb phrase consisting of a verb, and it's the same verb in both of them with an alpha, a particle with the same subscript beta, and a noun phrase with the subscript gamma, and the only difference is in the order of the noun phrase and the particle. So we've stated a sister relation between these two constructions rather than a derivation which starts with the particle in one position and moves to the other. Another case would be a little more substantive, is the dative alternation, which has been explored by Elizabeth Traugott and Eva Zehentner. And here there's the two constructions, the ditransitive give Bill a book and the prepositional dative give a book to Bill. And it's basically the same story. We're saying, actually, when I was a grad student, we used to derive the ditransitive from the prepositional dative. And by about 1975, it was shown conclusively that you couldn't do that because there are slight semantic differences and you have to list which verbs undergo the rule and so on. You can't derive them from one from the other. So the schema is non-productive. And so basically what we're saying is it's the same verb, it's the same the first object in the ditransitive corresponds to the object of to in the prepositional ditransitive, and the second object in the ditransitive corresponds to the direct object in the prepositional dative. So again, we have a correspondence between two constructions now that don't mean exactly the same necessarily. And it's at least the ditransitive is non-productive. Another two cases, I'll be very quick. One is the relation between particle verbs again, and they're nominal. So if something blows up, it's a blow up. If you pick something up, it's a pickup. If you throw something away, it's a throwaway. If you knock somebody out, it's a knockout. And the semantic relation is a typical nominalization pattern. It's a result or an action or its result. And you can't derive the nominal from the particle verb, but you can relate them. This time we have sister schemas where one is in syntax and one is in morphosyntax. So it's not even a verb phrase corresponding to a noun phrase, it's a verb phrase corresponding to a noun. And a final case would be the symmetric predicate alternation, where we have X and Y are similar and X is similar to Y, and various cases of that. You can't derive, again, we thought back in 1965 that these were derived one from another, but it was shown by about 1971 that that was impossible. But the generalization is clear. If you have a symmetric predicate, it can usually appear both with a conjoined subject and with this other construction with a subject and a to phrase. I'm not quite sure how to formalize this one, but the challenge is really just for the notation, not for the conception of it. So now we're beginning to ask the question, what happens with all the things that we thought were syntactic movement? Can we account for all syntactic alternations in terms of sister schemas instead of movement rules? In other words, was Harris right in this respect? I don't know, but this is a big challenge for this theory. It would be really fun to try to work it out. I don't know whether I'll be able to do this or not. I have other things on my plate as well, but I hope someone will pick it up. So let me sum this up. Okay, the idea is that rules of grammar are encoded as schemas. The schemas are in the very same form as words, except that they contain variables. So that means the lexicon, or we could call it the extended lexicon if you like. The lexicon contains the grammar along with the words. Productive schemas can be used both to create novel forms, that's their generative function, and to capture generalizations within the lexicon, that's their relational function. The non-productive schemas are used only in the relational function. And more generally, the lexicon is very richly structured. It's not just a list of words or a list of words and idioms. It's full of relational links among the items. It's not just a list of exceptions. And the methodological conclusion is that linguistic theory should focus on lexical relations at least as much as on the construction of novel forms. Some directions that it might go from here. The obvious one is, can we apply the formalism to the full range of morphological phenomena in the languages of the world? Well, we've looked at a few things that we know about, but that's probably for someone else to do who knows those languages, all 6,000 of them. Can we connect this to morphological processing? Can we say, here are the representations, what happens to them as you're processing them, is producing them or understanding them? And we've made some progress in making a model of this that conforms to at least some people's idea of what's going on in processing. More speculatively, this whole story is based on the question of what does a speaker store and in what form. And so it's really a theory of memory in the linguistic domain. It's really a theory of knowledge of language. What about, so we can ask, what about knowledge of other cognitive domains? What about memory for music? Does it have the same sort of textures than memory for language? Just to get your juices flowing here, think about how many pieces of music you know. It's probably in the hundreds, maybe the thousands. Some of them might be quite long. In my case, they're pieces of music that are 3/4 of an hour long, and I know them well enough to identify them from a random place when I turn on the radio. Think about it the same way for yourself. And you're familiar with the style, so you can identify the style. You can actually identify a composer's style. This requires schemas, and you identify the similarity of parts of musical motives. That's relational links and so on. So you begin to ask, can we talk about understanding of music in the same way? Another domain might be the understanding of physical objects. Think of the thousands and thousands of objects you know about, both schematically, so you know about cups in general, and you might know about, let's say, my favorite coffee cup as a particular one, wugs, notice. So we have tokens and we have types that we know about. Those are related as in the same way as schemas and their instances. And finally, a domain of social cognition, all the people you know, all their relationships, all of your relationship to them, their personality, their interests, and so forth. A huge body of knowledge that we acquire continuously throughout life. The question is, does the relational morphology formalism tell us anything about those domains as well? Just built, instead of being built from linguistic primitives, they're built from other sorts of primitives. So that's the end of where I'm going to stop. That's research for the next 5 centuries or something. What I like about this whole approach is that unlike other morphological theories, it's leading us to look for integrating language with the rest of the mind. So it's really trying to fulfill the promise that generative grammar made back in the 1960s. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ray. I will applaud on behalf of everybody. Please multiply this by about 120, which is the number of attendees today. So that's what this talk actually deserves. That's the amount of applause this talk deserves. Okay. So, well, we will give a break for 10 minutes sharp. Then we will proceed with the Q&A session. So see you in a bit.
Productive or productive. So does this follow, would you say that all of the rules in a language can be learned without any need for some of them to be innate, for some sort of universal grammar, which I think this is not your position. And if you say this is not the case, how would it work? So some of the schemas would be part of universal grammar and some of them not. So since the distinction is not really clear between schemas or rules and words, so how would that work in your framework?
I think one of the things that you have to specify as innate is what are the units out of which you're building schemas. So you have to know that, let's say, to acquire phonology, you have to know that the acoustic signal or the phonetic input can be segregated into discrete kinds of segments so that there's a finite repertoire. In the syntax, it's not clear. Oh, and you should be alert to stress differences and whatever one needs in doing phonology. In syntax, I'm not sure what to say about the parts of speech, but you have to know that there's something like an X-bar theory that the head, that a word can serve as a head and have dependence. In the semantics, probably the units of semantics have to be given because that's your conceptual system. Again, it has to be not, I don't take Fodor's view that all word meanings are innate, but because how do I want to put this? The number of possible word meanings seems to be unlimited. So there has to be some finite set of semantic primitives out of which your concepts are built. Now, as far as the acquisition of schemas, one nice feature of this formalism is that if you're trying to learn a schema, the way you do that is you find lexical, you find words, let's say, that are similar in some respects. That is, there are relational links between them, like ambition and ambitious. And then you say, if you get a bunch of these that are all the same in the same respect, now you can form a schema by simply taking the parts where they're the same, connecting those with a relational link, and then putting variables where they're different. So it's not sort of moving from one sphere of primitives, from the lexical primitives, to a different one, to the rule primitives. It's staying within the same space. It's a very simple formal operation to say what you're acquiring when you acquire schemas. I don't know if that helps answer your question or not.
Yeah, so it's more about items, the specific units of the meaning is what can be innate, you would say.
Yeah, it's the items out of which you can build things that have to be innate. So the relations and now we can ask how many of those things are domain general. Well, I think phonology is not domain general, and I think syntax is not domain general. I think semantics probably is available without language because we find counterparts of the way we think in a lot of in chimpanzees, for example. A lot of the same issues arise in talking about their conceptualization. So that's, you know, a lot of the elements of human thought are found already in the other primates, I think. But not syntax and not phonology.
I see, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, great. And next is Buse Kurtar from Boğaziçi University. Buse, unmute yourself, please.
Hello, thank you for the very informative and entertaining for me talk. So sorry if this doesn't come out right, but from the page 7 of your paper, which you have presented, the co-index 3, I believe, the likeness of the relationship, has some implications in terms of restricting about the predictions, what kind of possible relational interpretations the variable co-index X forms, from what I understand.
I'm not entirely following.
Okay.
Again?
Yeah, sure.
I don't have the reading in front of me, so this is...
Yeah. So from the example you gave, piggish, childish, foolish, these are all ish in terms of their likeness of some sort of acting.
Yes.
So, in terms of piggish, it is not the color. That was one of your examples.
So I see. So you're suggesting that you could actually narrow down the semantics beyond being just a like something. It means acting like something. You're suggesting.
Well, I don't necessarily suggest anything, but I was curious about what would you say in terms of this relationship between the likeness or and the co-index X.
Mm-hmm. The co-index X is the schema's variable for the function.
Yes.
For like. Wait, co-index X is the base. Co-index X is the base, right? So that's the pig, the child, the thug, the slug, and so forth. So now that I've identified what you're talking about, what's the question again?
So how this base is in relation with the function. So I think the base is more of a static picture, or more of a static scheme, if I may say.
Well, the index X is standing for the argument of the function, right? The function is like, and the argument of the function is so the function itself is sort of the meaning of the suffix, right? So the suffix means like something. and the X stands for what it's like. Does that help?
Thank you.
All right, maybe we should move on.
Okay, thanks. The next question is from Utku Türk from Boğaziçi University. Utku, unmute yourself, please.
Hi, hello, Jackendoff. Thank you for the nice talk. I have a question. It's more like an elaboration question. So can you elaborate a bit more on the possible challenges for relational morphology for describing the languages of the world, and how this challenges is related to relational morphology, since describing the languages of the world is already hard. So
Yeah.
why do you think having that point is important? Having that point is important.
Well, if we're claiming that this formalism, this way of thinking about morphology, is the way the human mind deals with morphology, it had better deal with all the kinds of crazy things that happen in morphology cross-linguistically. I mean, we've dealt mostly with English. We have a few examples from Dutch and German, a few examples from Italian, a few examples from more exotic. When we want to talk about reduplication, we have to talk about some other language. What is it, Mangyanari or something like that? But you know, the literature in morphology says here's all these weird things that happen, and here's all the conditions on these weird things. There's a whole industry on the Latin verb conjugation, and so the question is, can we give a more insightful story about those things than the folks who've been spending their lives at it? I don't know. And that's the big question. Is this sufficient for doing, let's say, an agglutinative language like Mohawk or Navajo or something like that, where or Turkish for that matter, with the huge collection of suffixes that you can use to that sort of mix up inflection and derivation. Rabia will tell you we did Turkish vowel harmony in class once. It looks like there's a way to do that. So we just have to find out. And given that at the moment there's only 2 of us doing relational morphology, and there are hundreds of people doing morphology in the rest of the world, we're sure hoping someone will pick up the ball and run with it.
Okay. The next question is going to be from Arif Milani from Boğaziçi University. Arif, unmute yourself, please.
Hi everyone, and thank you for the talk, Professor Jackendoff. My question is this: like, taking the word "Loudon." I'm not a native speaker, and I know most people would say it's not a word, but I also think most people would at least arrive at a rough interpretation of "Loudon" as make something loud.
Right.
So my question is this: the reason why we get a feeling like this, is it because of schemas that are purely generative? Because in your paper, you say that there are no purely generative schemas. Schemas are either both relational and generative, or just relational.
Right, right. So, well, the idea is that once we have a schema for something, we can imagine words that could exist but don't, right? And that's what I take Loudon to be. And if somebody uses it, they're either using it to make an effect, or or out of ignorance because they think there's such a word, I guess. But for example, Jenny said to me at one point when I put Dutch-style handlebars on my bike, she said, "Did you Dutchify your bike yet?" Well, that's certainly a word that never existed before. It's not listed in the lexicon. So we're taking this -ify suffix, which is non-productive, and using it as though it were productive. So you can cheat with at least with some suffixes. Does that make sense?
I mean, so what is the mechanism responsible for that? So purely generative schemas?
No, it's that a relational schema can be used. A relational schema can be used to generate new forms, at least for some suffixes. But at the same time, it's predominantly used relationally. You can, sort of stretch it if you want to, but it's taken to be sort of a term of art. Another example would be there was a headline that said the Trumpification of Mike Pence. So it's making somebody into a Trump supporter, right? Well, this was a word that didn't exist before, and it's recognized as sort of clever, but it's not a real word. Now, let's say it's not a word that's stored in people's lexicons. So we've stretched the ify and occasion suffixes to a new case, but that's not their normal mode of operation.
Okay, so it's not the purely generative schema.
No,
there aren't purely generative schemas then.
No, for it to be a generative schema alone would mean that you don't store anything. You're always building things generatively every time you use them. And so the idea here is the brain, if there are chunks that it can use over and over again, it says, why not make a schema, basically, so that I don't have to store all the examples that I hear anymore.
Thank you.
All right, the next question is from Alper Demircan from Yeditepe University. His microphone won't work, so he typed his question, so I'm posting it so that everybody can see. All right, can you see this? I'm gonna read it. Storing grammar rules as instances idea is really consistent with interactive models, even more than mini-modularity, as you suggested, on consciousness and computational mind. To what extent do the distributional connectionist models help us understand the interaction of linguistic knowledge with domain general conceptual structures, although you think such models are neurally implausible?
Can you read it one more time, please?
Storing grammar rules as instances idea, I mean, the idea that storing grammar rules as instances is really consistent with interactive models, even more than mini-modularity, as you suggested, on consciousness and computational mind on your book.
Yes.
To what extent do the distributional connectionist models help us understand the interaction of linguistic knowledge with domain general conceptual structures, although you think such models are neurally implausible? Okay,
that's a number of questions rolled into one. I do think that this is very much compatible with interactionist views, where you can bring semantic knowledge, word knowledge or world knowledge to bear on your understanding of sentences and discourses and so on. So information can come from any place, as long as there are interface links that permit that information to be put to use in the domain that you're trying to operate in. So you can't get phonological, you can't have semantics bearing on phonology without interfaces through syntax to phonology from the semantics. What does it have to say about connectionist, how connectionist distributional models can be useful here? I'm not sure. I mean, I've never been convinced that connectionist sorts of models can account for any sort of structure. In particular, I take very seriously work by Gary Marcus that shows that even identity relations are hard to, let's say a productive identity relation is hard to deal with in a connectionist model. Anything that has to do with variable instantiation or storage of variables is very hard to imagine within a connectionist framework. And I'm not convinced, I'm willing to have somebody change my mind, but so far I haven't seen anything that corresponds to variable instantiation, which is what we need in order to talk about schemas at all.
Okay, thank you. I hope that was satisfying. Okay, he says it's much clear. Thank you. All right. The last student question from Furkan Atmaca from Boğaziçi University. Furkan, unmute yourself, please.
Thank you for the nice talk. So my question is that if we are going to move on with a schematic view of language and language knowledge in the mind, how come do we not find the contextual structures more in the word derivations we have? If it is possible to trace back connections or have tags indicating where things go in our mind, why not? Why is it the case that we have so isolated or grouped variables in places that do not really interact well with each other or need an interface in between them so that they can have some sort of connection?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but let me try. The idea is, I mean, if you think about language as a mapping between phonology and semantics, or actually between phonetics and semantics, okay, the units that you need for semantics are things that you need for inference, for forming inferences. So it's things like objects and places and causes and mental states and trajectories and all kinds of things like that. Phonetics is saying, or phonology is saying, here's the sequence of speech sounds with stress on them. And, you know, it has, you can't build inferences on strings of, you can't define inferences over strings of speech sounds. So you have to say there's some way to map between these strings of speech sounds, this particular kind of structure that we call phonological structure, and this other one that's good for doing inferences and understanding the world and interacting with what you see in the world and where you go in the world and how you act in the world, all those sorts of things. You have to have some way of translating the phonological information into the semantic information. They can't just be sort of mixed together. They're of quite different sorts. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, but how do we organize? How can we say that these relations go in the way they go, or in what way they are formed? How can we formalize that part? Because it's clearly, as you said, that the gap between the phonetic or the acoustic or even a way of information in sign languages, there's no such thing as acoustics you would use to connect to semantics, is that there are ways of getting there. So how can we say that this variable belongs to this sort of medium and it can only interact with these two, but not with the one that's way outside its form?
Well, that's the role of the interface links that say, how do we get from one layer to another? And right, and that the interface links have to go all the way from the individual word level or even the affix level to syntax and semantics, and eventually from semantics there has to be interface links to, let's say, the visual system and the motor system and so forth, maybe with some intermediary representations. How are they formed? I don't know. I mean, we have to understand how the brain grows. I mean, to put it in brain terms, we have no idea. We have no idea.
I was trying to get to this.
Right? I mean, we have no idea how something as simple as a speech sound is encoded in the neurons, right? We just have to trust that someday someone will figure it out. And what I like about this theory is it's at least saying, if you're going to connect to brain computation, here's where you will connect. You will have these sorts of pieces. A standard derivational generative grammar doesn't give you a handle on this, because it's saying, well, here's this very complicated thing and you build it step by step. And yet it's being in the brain, it's developing in parallel. And a lot of it is stored, and you know, we don't know how neurons can do these sorts of things yet.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I mean, this is something I've been saying for 50 years, and the situation has not gotten a lot better. We know where things happen in the brain, but not what's going on there.
Okay, so thank you. And now it is time for faculty members to ask their questions. If you have a question, please type something like, I have a question. So first of all, we have Dr. Duygu Özge from Middle East Technical University. Duygu, can you unmute yourself? Okay.
Maybe not.
Duygu, can you hear us? All right, so I'm going to take the next question and then go back to Duygu Özge's question. Ömer Demirok from Boğaziçi University. Ömer, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Good. Hello, Ray. Thank you for the talk. So I have a question about, 3 cases related to blocking and morphological blocking. So you talked about you talked about cases like sheep, for example. You had a special entry for the plural form. I remember, as far as I can remember. So I assume that that will be your mechanism of blocking. Like, let's say you have children blocking childs, or went blocking goad, stuff like that. So that's one case. I assume you deal with that by positing a different lexical entry or of some sort. In addition to that, we have 2 other cases related to this, but not really, it doesn't really follow from distributed morphology assumptions, etc. So these are problematic for those theories as well. So these cases are like the optionality cases where irregular form doesn't really block the regular form. So you have, dreamed and dreamt. So both are fine. And you also have, the third case, you have paradigm gaps. So dive, for example, doesn't have a participle form. People just cannot produce. So these 3, I mean, the latter 2, patterns are actually not accounted for under DM either. So I don't know if your theory would allow have any additional insight on that.
I think our general story on blocking so far would be appeal to the elsewhere principle, to say you always choose the thing with more structure if you can. Mm-hmm. As for the second case is where you have both forms.
Yeah, so optionality.
You have to store both forms with some degree of. One of the things I haven't talked about is the degree of lexical strength that comes from, or resting activation or something like that. And I think you have to say they have approximately equal resting activation. About the third case with the paradigm gaps, I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't think anyone does, so we'll be.
Right, I mean, there are famous cases in Russian that don't wear their gaps, I guess. Or, you're right, these very strange past tenses.
Yeah.
Past participles, yeah. So is that useful to know? That's just what we got? Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Good.
Okay, so let's check if Duygu is back. Duygu, if you're back,
I'm here.
Unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, gotcha.
Hi, Ray, good to see you. Sorry about the first time I couldn't do it. So my question is a follow-up question to the first question about language acquisition. So you envision the conceptual structures, I mean the conceptual schemas to be innate, but you said that it is something smaller than what Fodor originally assumes, right? But it also looks somehow larger than the type of core systems adopted by Susan Carey or Liz Spelke. So am I right in this?
I think in some respects, yes. Yeah.
So my question, so in this system, you do not need any innate grammatical rules. You have systems, I mean, conceptual systems at place, the schemas, but you don't have anything else, right?
Well, you have to have something that you can build it from. You have to have basic units. So you have to know that there's something like parts of speech that have different roles in the syntax. And you have to know that there are things like syllables and you have to pay attention to stress, and that depends on syllable weight, and you have to look, you know, I mean, you have to learn the rules of your language or the schemas for your language, but they have to be, the schemas are built out of some innate vocabulary. They have to be, they can't come from nowhere. I think Fodor was right about this, right? I mean, that you can't build something from nothing. You can't build a sphere from Lego blocks.
So you have some kind of grammatical categories and other primitives, grammatical primitives at place, but you don't need grammar rules then.
Possibly you need the notion of rules, because that's what determines, you need the notion of rules because that determines what the repertoire of categories is.
Okay, so what would be the advantage of such a system compared to a system where we have grammar and lexicon separated?
Well, it means that in order to learn a grammatical rule, formally it's just putting variables. It's creating a new lexical entry that has variables where the things it's related to are different and constant where they're the same. So it's, instead of going, here's these things that are the same, now we're going to make a rule over in some other space, in some other part of the brain or whatever. It's saying we're building something of exactly the same structure, except it has more variables in it.
Okay.
But from a formal point of view, it's much nicer, and it lends itself to item-based acquisition, which has to be the way it works.
Okay, yeah, that would be that would have been my next question. So you would assume a constructivist perspective where
Sure.
we have conceptual structures and grammatical rules at place, but we still learn lexical items on an item-based level.
And yes, and you learn schemas on an item-based, from an item-based perspective. So you say, here are these things that I've learned, these items that I've learned, what do they have in common? Can I make a schema out of that?
Okay, so what kind of a learning mechanism then would we require for this?
Oh boy. I mean, I don't know what it takes to learn words. I mean, people have been tearing their hair out over this for 50 years, right?
Yeah.
So all we've thought about is the acquisition of schemas given the knowledge of words. And it comes in a couple of stages. You have to say, well, there's a schema. Now, is it productive or non-productive? And it would seem that the default assumption is it's not productive. I don't add any new items to my lexicon when I build this schema. I just say, oh, this captures the relation among these items. Now I have to decide, am I allowed to extend it to further items to make it generative? And that, again, we're not sure what the criteria are. I mean, this is the kind of thing that Charles Yang is open to, right?
Yeah, now the puzzle, I think, is that you do not need then any conceptual basis or any grammatical basis as innate in this system. If you learn things as item-based, why do you need some innate concepts or grammatical categories at place?
The reason is the same as I answered that previous question. You need a vocabulary of primitives out of which you can code the items, right? The items don't come for free in your head. You have to make that up. And you have to have a repertoire of possibilities for putting concepts together on the basis of your perception and how people talk and whatever is involved. But you need to have those primitives innate so that you can even build a lexical entry for the items. And then going on from there to the schemas is not so hard, maybe.
Okay, so that's where you differ from a typical constructivist learning perspective then.
Exactly.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
All right, thanks, Duygu. The next is Professor Aslı Göksel from Boğaziçi University. Aslı Hocam, can you please unmute yourself?
Hi, I hope you can hear me well because there's some drilling going on in the background. So I have two questions. One has to do with a comment that you made about examples like day by day, where you said that these were non-productive schemas in the syntax. So to me, this is puzzling because I would have expected you to say that they are also in the lexicon. So on what basis do you decide something is in the lexicon and something is in the syntax? That's the first question. The second question is
Can I answer that first so I don't forget it?
Okay.
The idea is, think about the idioms again, like spill the beans.
Yeah.
That has syntactic structure, but it's a lexical item, right? It's stored, it has to be stored in the lexicon because you know it as a unit. So to say it's in the grammar versus it's in the syntax versus it's in the lexicon, at least in this view, is a category mistake. Because the issue is, what kind of structure does it have? Does it have syntactic structure? Does it have morphological structure? As opposed to, is it stored in the lexicon, or is it built online, whenever you encounter it?
But you gave the example day by day as a counter, as an opposing
okay.
example.
Oh yeah. So this is a syntactic configuration, I think, that is the pattern is not productive. So actually, it's productive on the choice of noun. So you can say day by day, you can say week by week, you can say paper by paper, you can say question by question, and so on. So the noun is productive. The noun choice of noun is productive, but the choice of preposition is not. It's just
so they are like idioms. Are you saying they are like idioms? Because in your example.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay, then there's no problem. Then I misunderstood you.
Okay,
so
yes.
My second question is about the general architecture of grammar. You mentioned yourself that your model has affinities to the Ackermann-Neeleman model.
Yeah.
And in their model, where you have morphosyntax, they have slightly different wording. They have word syntax. Mm-hmm. And the interaction between word syntax and phrase syntax is such that when there's a conflict, word syntax wins. How does your model deal with those cases that they mention, or that Anderson mentions in his book, like the Kwakwala, the well-known Kwakwala examples? Or any example in which, for example, the ordering of morphemes does not reflect the syntactic structure of a particular word internal phrasal constellation?
Yeah, this is difficult for me to answer because I'm not on top of these examples, but
for example, an item may have scope over the whole of the word, like in a complex word, it might have scope over the whole word, but it's stuck somewhere in which it looks as if it has scope just over the preceding.
I think it's a matter of trying to write a schema that picks out this particular structure. I mean, to say it has scope says there is some schema that says when you have this kind of word that has scope, here's how you measure it out. Here's how you determine what's the scope. So the structure of the word is not just the part that's the phonology, but the structure that goes with it. And now you can stipulate, if it's in some non-canonical order, you can stipulate that in a schema. Whether that's the right way to do it or not depends on the case in question. And I haven't tried to do these, so I can't really tell you.
Okay, so in a way, it's close to their model. So yes, you are putting them in a schema, and you are in the end saying that morphology wins in the end.
It can, or you could set it up so morphology wins, or you could set it up so syntax wins. But if morphology is involving things that are stored, then it's like the blocking I was talking about before. The stored material usually wins, just because it's actually on processing grounds, because it's easier to access it than to construct it. So if it's there and you hear it, that you don't, if it's in what you hear and you can construct the meaning of what you hear, then you store that. In fact, deciding whether you store something or not is not a decision. It's a matter of how much evidence accumulates and adds to the strength of this particular item in memory. I
Okay.
don't know if that helps.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
All right, the next question is from Professor Sumru Özsoy from Boğaziçi University. Sumru Hocam, can you unmute yourself, please?
I'll try.
Good, gotcha.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for this extremely interesting talk and presentation of the theory. But I have a question with respect to the formalization of your schemas. Now, part of which was actually answered, by the fact that the representation is on the basis of lexical items. So that what we are dealing with is, in fact, quite an extended lexicon in our general view of grammar. However, in that generalization, in that representation, actually, for some items like, impetuous, where there is, as you said, there is no root. What type of, and the representation for the morphosyntax of that item was that you have a dash or a hyphen plus the affix is,
Right.
and then that hyphen is, it occurred in almost all sequences where there is no kind of item, a free lexical item, which occurs in the lexicon, but then the output, of that together with the affix or the prefix, whatever, occurs. Which means then in that representation, the hyphen can, does not have any kind of content to it at the morphosyntactic level. Whereas particularly with, both the derivation and, inflection, obviously, the input to the whole process has something to do about the parts of speech, information about the category of the input into that affixation. And however, with a dash, is there any, my question actually is there any property that is related to that dash in the morphosyntactic level of the, of the representation of the schema, is, I think, my question.
I think we want to say, at least the way we formulated it, is the dash is just an absence. So it has no properties. It's just, so you could leave it out entirely, but it would make the representation kind of funny to look at, because it would just say this thing is morphosyntactically just an affix, and that's not right. But we don't want to think in terms of input and output, remember. Not an it's just a correspondence between, so let's say joyous says, I'm connected to joy on one side and I'm connected to us on the other side. Gorgeous says, I'm not connected to anybody on this side, but I'm connected to us, O-U-S, on this side. So it's the right-hand half of the word is motivated and the left-hand half is just like any other, like dog or something. It's unmotivated by anything. So you have no help in learning that part of the word. Whereas if you learn something with a lexical base, you say, oh, I know that word. It's easier for me to learn it because it's related to something I know. We have other cases like laughter, where it has a lexical base and it has what looks like a suffix, but there's no other word that has that suffix. So do we want to say, well, the input is laugh, and how does the grammar say the input is laugh and the only thing you can add to it is ter, or ter is a suffix that only belongs on laugh. In our approach, it says, here's something that looks like an affix, but there's no schema that produces that accounts for that affix. You have to learn it on just from scratch. But the laugh part you know about. So it's sort of symmetrical, whether the adjective is, whether the base is a lexical item or whether the affix is an independent lexical item. Remember, the schema is a lexical item as well. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, kind of. So there is no kind of information with respect to one of the forms being the head and the other one not the head, but an affix kind of. So that we're not dealing with like empty heads, which was a problem in syntax for some time, in part of the development of the theory, a lot of empty heads kind of. So in this schema, it's not that we have an empty head anywhere because it's,
Yeah, it's just nothing. It's like the plural of sheep, where there's nothing. It's an empty morpheme.
Yeah, okay, but in the morphosyntax of that representation, I think you had sheep plus plural, right?
That's right.
So that there is information that it is plural.
Right, but the idea is that the same sorts of conditions occur in all the three components. So there are things that are morphological but have no meaning. There are things that are syntactic and phonological, that are syntactic and semantic but have no phonological reflex, like the plural of sheep. There are things that have a semantics and morphology but no syntax, and so on. So the same kinds of things can occur all up and down. And what interface links you need in the whole lexical item.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there any other questions? We can take one more. All right, I think that's it.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Ray, for accepting my invitation in such a short notice, and it's always a pleasure to listen to you.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to talk to all of your colleagues and students and everything. It's without getting on an airplane.
Great, right? But hopefully we will have you next year here. Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm gonna applaud again on behalf of everybody, or maybe we can do it visually, in both modalities. All right, great, thanks for joining me in this. Well, stay safe and healthy, everybody, and those in Turkey, enjoy the curfew. We're gonna get stuck at home for the next 4 days. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and see you next time.
Okay.
Bye-bye.